Crime and Punishment, Part 1, Chapter 1. Toward the end of a sultry afternoon in early July, a young man came out of his little room in Stolyarny Lane and turned slowly and somewhat irresolutely in the direction of Kameny Bridge. He had been lucky enough to escape an encounter with his landlady on the stairs. His little room, more like a cupboard than a place to live in, was tucked away under the roof of the high five-storied building. The landlady, who let him the room and provided him with dinner and service, occupied a flat on the floor below, and every time he went out he was forced to pass the door of her kitchen, which nearly always stood wide open. He went past each time with an uneasy, almost frightened feeling that made him frown with shame. He was heavily in debt to his landlady and shrank from meeting her. It was not that he had been a cowed or unnaturally timorous person, far from it, but he had been for some time in an almost morbid state of irritability and tension. He had cut himself off from everybody and withdrawn so completely into himself that he now shrank from every kind of contact. He was crushingly poor, but he no longer felt the oppression of his poverty. For some time he had ceased to concern himself with his everyday affairs. He was not really afraid of any landlady, whatever plots he might think she was hatching against him. But to have to stop on the stairs and listen to all her chatter about trivialities in which he refused to take any interest, all her complaints, threats, and insistent demands for payment, and then to have to extricate himself, lying and making excuses. No, better to creep downstairs as softly as a cat and slip out unnoticed. This time, however, he reached the street feeling astonished at the intensity of his fear of his landlady. To think that I can contemplate such a terrible act and yet be afraid of such trifles, he thought as he smiled strangely. Yes, a man holds the fate of the world in his two hands, and yet, simply because he is afraid, he just lets things drift. This is a truism. I wonder what men are most afraid of. Any new departure, and especially a new world, especially a new word, that is what they fear most of all. But I am talking too much. That's why I don't act, because I am always talking. Or perhaps I talk so much just because I can't act. I have got into a habit of babbling to myself during this last month, while I have been lying in a corner for days on end, thinking, fantastic nonsense. And why have I come out now? Can I really be capable of that? Am I really serious? No, of course, I'm not serious. So I'm just amusing myself with fancies. Children's games? Yes, perhaps I am only playing a game. The heat in the streets was stifling. The stuffiness, the jostling crowds, the bricks and mortar, scaffolding and dust everywhere, and that peculiar summer stench so familiar to anyone who cannot get away from St. Petersburg into the country, all combined to aggravate the disturbance of the young man's nerves. The intolerable reek from the public houses, so numerous in that part of the city, and the sight of the drunken men encountered at every turn, even though this was not a holiday, completed the mournfully repellent picture. An expression of the deepest loathing passed across the young man's delicate features. He was, by the way, a strikingly handsome young man, with fine dark eyes, brown hair, and a slender, well-knit figure, taller than the average. Soon, however, he relapsed again into profound thought, or rather into a sort of abstraction, and continued on his way in complete and willful unconscious of his surroundings. Once or twice he muttered something to himself in a manner that, as he had just confessed, had grown habitual with him. He realized that at times his thoughts were confused and that he was very weak. He had eaten practically nothing for 2 days. He was so wretchedly dressed that anybody else, however used to them, might have hesitated to go out in daylight in such rags. It is true that it would have been difficult to attract attention by one's dress in that part of central St. Petersburg. In these streets and alleys near the Haymarket, With their numerous houses of ill fame, and their swarming population of artisans and laborers, such queer figures sometimes appeared on the scene that even the oddest of them could hardly arouse any surprise. Besides, the young man's heart was so full of bitter scorn that, in spite of his often very youthful sensitiveness, wearing his rags in the street caused him no embarrassment. It would have been different had he come across any of his acquaintances or former friends whom he wished in any case to avoid. All the same, when a drunken man who was being carted off somewhere in an enormous dray drawn by an equally enormous cart horse suddenly yelled as he went by, "Hi, you in the German hat!" and went on pointing at him and bawling at the top of his voice, the young man stopped dead and clutched feverishly at his hat. It was a high, round hat, which had come from Zimmermann's famous hat shop, but was now all rubbed and rusty with age, stained and full of slits. What remained of its battered brim was cocked up grotesquely at one side, but it was not shame, but an entirely different emotion, more like terror, that had seized him. "I knew it," he muttered in confusion. "I foresaw something like this. But this is worse than anything I thought of. A piece of stupidity like this, an insignificant trifle, might wreck the whole affair. Yes, the hat is too noticeable. It is ridiculous, and that means that it attracts attention. I must get a cap, any sort of old cap, to go with my rags, not this monstrosity. Nobody wears this sort of thing. It will be noticed a mile off, and remembered. That's the point. It will be remembered afterward, and it will be evidence. I must be as inconspicuous as possible. Trifles are important. Trifles like this can bring disaster." He had not far to go. He even knew how many paces it was from his own door. Exactly 730. He had counted them once, when he had first begun to give his imagination free rein. At that time he did not believe in the reality of his imaginings, and their audacity, which both repelled and fascinated him at the same time, was merely irritating. Now, a month later, he saw them in a different light, and had somehow grown used to regarding the ugly dream as a real project, although he still did not trust himself to carry it out, and reproached himself for his own weakness and lack of resolution. He was now engaged in rehearsing his project, and his agitation increased with every step he took. With a fainting heart and shuddering nerves, he approached an enormous building which fronted the canal on one side and Sadovaya Street on the other. The building was split up into small tenements, which housed all kinds of tradespeople, tailors, locksmiths, cooks, various German craftsmen, prostitutes, clerks, and so on. People were hurrying in and out of its two gates and across its two courtyards. The building had 3 or 4 porters, and the young man thought himself lucky not to meet any of them as he slipped from the gate to the first staircase on the right. It was narrow and dark, but he already knew that, and the circumstance pleased him. In such obscurity there was no danger from prying eyes. If I feel so afraid at this moment, what would it be like if I had really brought myself to the point of doing the thing itself? He thought involuntarily, as he came up from the 4th floor. Here his way was blocked by 2 porters, old soldiers, who were removing furniture from one of the flats. He knew that a German clerk lived here with his family. The German must be removing, and that means the old woman's will be the only flat occupied on the 4th floor on this staircase. At any rate, for some time. That's fine, in case he thought, and he rang the old woman's bell. The bell tinkled feebly, as though it were made of tin, not copper. Small flats in that kind of house, nearly all of such bells, but he had forgotten what it sounded like, and its peculiar tinkle seemed to startle him, as if he brought back something to his memory with great clearness. He shuddered. Evidently his nerves were too weak this time. After a short interval, the door opened the merest crack, and a woman peered suspiciously out at her visitor. Only her glittering little eyes were visible in the gloom. She seemed reassured, however, when she saw that there were several people on the landing and opened the door wider. The young man stepped across the threshold into a dark hall divided by a partition from the tiny kitchen. The old woman stood silently before him, looking at him with a question in her eyes. She was a tiny, dried-up scrap of a creature, about 60 years old, with sharp, malicious little eyes and a small, sharp nose. She was bare-headed, and her fair hair, just beginning to go gray, was thick with grease. A strip of flannel was twisted around her long, thin neck, which was wrinkled and yellow like a hen's leg. And in spite of the heat, a short jacket of worn fur, yellow with age, hung from her shoulders. She coughed and groaned continually. The young man must have been looking at her rather oddly, for distrust flashed into her eyes again. Reminding himself that he must be as polite as possible, the young man made a hurried half-bow and muttered, "Raskolnikov, a student. I was here a month ago." "I remember you were, my friend. I remember very well," the old woman answered dryly, still without taking her eyes from his face. "Well, I've come again on the same business," continued Raskolnikov, rather disconcerted by her suspicion. Perhaps, though, he thought uneasily, she was always like this, only I didn't notice it before. The old woman remained silent, apparently still doubtful, and then stood aside and pointed to a door, as she let her visitor pass. "Go in, my friend." The little room the young man entered, with its faded wallpaper, geraniums, and muslin window curtains, was bright with the rays of the setting sun. The unexpected thought crossed his mind, the sun will be shining then, too, just as it does now. He glanced rapidly round the room, trying to fix its appearance as firmly in his mind as possible. There was nothing special about it. The old furniture, all of painted yellow wood, consisted of a sofa with a high curved wooden back, an oval table in front of it, a toilet table with a small mirror between the windows, some chairs against the wall, and 2 or 3 cheap pictures in yellow frames representing German young ladies with birds in their hands. That was all. In a corner, a lamp was burning before a small icon. Everything was very clean. Both the furniture and the floor were highly polished, and everything shone. Lizaveta's work, he thought the young man. There was not a speck of dust anywhere in the flat. How do nasty old women contrive to have everything so clean? He continued to himself, with his curious glance fixed on the print curtain hanging over the door into another tiny room. In this stood the old woman's bed and chest of drawers, and he had never contrived to see into it. The flat contained only these 2 rooms. "What can I do for you?" inquired the old woman in a forbidding tone. She had followed him in and planted herself squarely in front of him, and was looking him in the face as before. "I have brought something to pawn here," and he drew from his pocket an old flat silver watch, with a globe engraved on the back and a steel guard. "But it is time you redeemed your other pledge. The month was up 2 days ago." "I will pay you another month's interest. Please be patient." "I shall please myself, my friend, whether I am patient or sell your property now." "How much for the watch, Elena Ivanova?" "It is not really worth anything. You bring me nothing but trash, my friend. Last time I lent you 2 rubles on a ring you could buy from a jeweler for 1.5 rubles. Let me have 4 rubles. I will redeem it. It was my father's. I am expecting some money soon." 1.5 rubles, interest in advance. Take it or leave it." 1.5 rubles, exclaimed the young man. "Just as you like," and the old woman held out the watch to him. The young man took it, so angry that he was on the point of leaving at once, but he changed his mind, remembering that he had nowhere else to turn, and that he had another object in coming. "All right," he said roughly. The old woman felt her pocket for her keys and went into the other room behind the curtain. The young man, left alone, strained his ears and followed her movements in imagination. He could hear her opening the chest of drawers. That will be the top drawer, he fancied. I know she keeps the keys in her right-hand pocket. They are all in one bunch on a steel ring. There is one with toothed wards, 3 times as big as the others. That can't belong to the drawer, of course. There must be something else, a chest or a trunk. I wonder if there is. Those big wooden trunks always have that kind of key. All the same, how sickening all this is, the old woman returned. Now, my friend, 10 kopecks per ruble per month makes 15 kopecks from you for 1.5 rubles for 1 month in advance. There are 20 kopecks due for the 2 rubles I lent you before at the same rate. 35 altogether. That makes 1 ruble, 15 kopecks for the watch. Here you are. What? So now it's 1 ruble, 15 kopecks. Quite correct. The young man did not argue but took the money. He was in no hurry to leave and stood there looking at the old woman as if he wanted to say or do something more, but he did not know exactly what. Perhaps, Alina Ivanova, I will bring you something else in a day or 2. It's silver, valuable, a cigarette case. I have to get it back from a friend. He faltered and stopped. Time enough to talk about it then, my friend. Good night. You always seem to be alone in the place. Isn't your sister here? He asked as carelessly as he could. He went into the hall. And what do you want with her, my friend? Nothing in particular, I only asked. But you, goodbye, Alina Ivanova. Raskolnikov went out in great confusion. The confusion grew, and on his way downstairs he stopped more than once as if struck by something or other. When at last he reached the street, he broke out, "Oh God, how repulsive! Can I possibly? No, that's nonsense. It's ridiculous," he broke off decisively. "How could such a horrible idea enter my mind? What vileness my heart seems capable of. The point is that it is vile, filthy, horrible, and for a whole month I have..." But words and exclamations were not a sufficient outlet for his agitation. The feeling of infinite loathing that he had begun to burden and torment him while he was on his way to the old woman's had now reached such a pitch that he did not know what to do with himself in his anguish. He walked along the pavement like a drunken man, not seeing the passers-by and sometimes bumping into them. He had left that street behind before he succeeded in collecting his wits. He looked round and saw that he was standing outside a public house, whose entrance led down several steps from the street into a basement. 2 tipsy men were at that moment engaging, supporting each other and swearing, as they staggered up into the street. Raskolnikov hesitated only for a moment, and then went down the steps. He had never set foot in such a place before, but now his head was swimming and his throat was parched. He felt a need for cold beer, especially as he now attributed his sudden weakness to having nothing to eat. He sat down in a dark and dirty corner behind a small, sticky table, ordered his beer, and drank the first glass thirstily. He began to feel better at once, and his thoughts grew clearer. "This is all nonsense," he said to himself hopefully, and there was no need to get so agitated. It was simply physical weakness. 1 glass of beer and a rusk, and my mind grows keen, my thoughts clear, my resolution firm. Bah, how paltry it all is! But in spite of the scorn with which he spat out these words, his outlook had grown cheerful, as if he had been suddenly freed from a terrible burden, and he cast friendly glances at other people in the room. Even at this moment he dimly perceived, however, that there was something morbid in his sudden recovery of spirits. Few people now remained in the place. Besides the 2 tipsy men he had met on the stairs, a party of 4 or 5 men and a woman with an accordion had also gone out. After they left, the place seemed quiet and empty. There remained a man who looked like a small tradesman, drunk, but not very, sitting over his beer. His companion, a huge fat man, with a grey beard, wearing a long Siberian tunic, was very drunk and sat dozing on a bench. Every now and then, half waking up, he would suddenly begin to snap his fingers, throwing his arms wide, and jerk the top part of his body about without getting up from his bench. Meanwhile, he would drone out the half-forgotten words of some rubbishy song, something like, "For a whole year I loved my wife. For a whole year I loved my wife." Or, "As I was walking down the street, my old lost love I chanced to meet." But there was nobody to share his jollity. His friend watched all these outbursts silently, and with a hostile and suspicious expression. There was one other man who looked like a retired government clerk, sitting apart with his bottle of vodka, taking a drink from time to time and gazing round. He, too, seemed to be in rather a disturbed state of mind.